Just one more minute, everybody. We'll let give people. Okay, good morning and welcome everybody. Let's get started. My name is Stephen Ma and I'll be your presenter for today. Welcome to our webinar for the next 50 minutes, 50, on leading high-performance distributed teams with empathy. We're going to talk about three major topics today. The first is empathy. What is it? How to practice getting it. Influence versus control, power dynamics, and what you can do to influence the power dynamics in your teams and your organizations. And three, the most powerful force in distributed teams and indeed in agility, output versus outcome, articulating it, measuring it, doing practical things to help move us forward for it. So it is my sincere pleasure to present some of the ideas that we've been working on with you. So first, let's talk about the case for change. Why do we care about this stuff? Why do we care about high performing teams? Why do we care about like working out what to do in now that we're all distributed? Well, obviously, the world, you don't need me to explain this to you, is in a bit of a crisis at the moment. Organizations are suffering in many, many different ways, both very real and real in terms of performance, in terms of their business outcomes, as well as psychological in terms of people's hearts and minds. It's at this point in time when we're experiencing hard times as a globe and as a set of businesses that it behooves us to look back at history to say, okay, well, these things have happened before. What did people do during this time? And like any general manager with their soul will tell you, one should, or any executive will tell you, one should never waste a good crisis. So what is the appropriate lesson to learn out of here? Well, Harvard Business Review in their May-June issue did a roundup of all the various studies that were done on these kinds of crisis points in 2010. And their findings were very, very useful to us. One of the major studies had 4,700 public companies in the 1980s, 1990s, and the 2000 recession. In those companies, 17% of the companies that they studied went bankrupt, were private, and acquired during that time of adverse change and rapid change, and adverse conditions. But here's the really interesting part. 9% of these businesses didn't just recover, they thrived. And to be specific, the parameters of their thriving was that they outperformed the competitors by 10% in sales and profit growth. They confirm, and this study was confirmed by additional studies by Bain and McKinsey throughout the same periods in the same crisis. And the Bain survey goes so far as to look at the Great Depression as well. So what's the magic secret sauce? There's something special about this particular 9% of companies. The report talks about it in some detail, but I can summarize it for you so you don't have to buy the issue. The preparation was the key difference, but it was a very specific kind of preparation. That kind of preparation was different to the 17% of the companies that went bankrupt and indeed everybody else that coasted along as a result of the crisis. Whilst others were in a survival mode, their normal reactions were things like deep cuts, a fear-based organization, and reacting defensively. The ones that outperformed had a success pattern. They considered this time for change, a high pressure exercise in change management. Things that were high pressure, yes, times were hard, but what were they going to do to change things for the better? And in actual fact, if you read the rest of this report, they're talking about discovering things that sometimes reinforce old adages, and in some cases, surprisingly challenge the status quo. In summary, a lot of these ideas are the ideas behind modern business agility, and I make the case for that today, talking about empathy and caring about people, talking about power dynamics and how you flatten the curve without necessarily changing your org structure, and about metricization, how you can measure your organization for its high levels of success. So here I am again. My name is Stephen. Why should you listen to me? I've been around the place. I've done some things in things like telco, worked overseas, worked in startups, worked in health tech, worked in government, worked in nonprofit. If you're interested in any of the places that I worked in before, or you want to talk to me about a few of these case studies, I'd be really enthused to do it. But I want to tell you about the reason that I do all these things. My personal mission is to make work more human. And I believe that by running webinars such as this, leading wonderful organizations such as Nomos, and having the privilege to consult with organizations like hopefully yours and any recommendations that you might make for us, we have the unique privilege of leveraging our skills to redesign organization towards lines of empathy, effectiveness, distributed teams, etc., to truly transform the way that we think of work so that work itself can be more human. So let's get into the meat of the presentation. Let's talk about empathy. Now, there's a lot of different definitions, so I'm going to anchor us on one particular definition. The one by Roman Kazanik, whose book we'll speak about in a little moment, defines empathy as having two parts. In pop psychology, we think of empathy as this thing. Oh, I feel what you're feeling. I feel your pain. I hear you. I emotionally react to your emotion. That particular aspect is an aspect of empathy, but I want to disambiguate a little bit and talk about as it being emotional mirroring. This is the human characteristic, the mirror neurons, if you will, of a person seeing somebody else happy, for example. Like if I'm smiling at you and I'm kind of energetic on the webcam, even though you might be sitting at your desk and maybe you've been in Zoom meetings for the last 4 hours, you will feel a certain amount of bouncy energy that I'm giving to you through the energy in my tone, the energy in my voice, the energy in my gesture, and that's going to create a little bit of emotional mirroring. Similarly would happen if I slowed down my talking, change my body language. You can feel me dragging you down from the mirror, from the emotions that you're getting mirrored. So that's one key part of empathy. Let me compare that with the second part. Arguably, according to Roman Kazanik, whose book we'll talk about momentarily, the second part, the more important part, this is called perspective taking. You can think of this anecdotally as walking a mile in somebody else's shoes. So being who I am, I will never truly understand, for example, what it is to be a woman or someone of a different race or someone that has a different socioeconomic background to myself. I can only simply have lived an experience that is mine and uniquely mine. But perspective taking is an ability, it's a capability, it's a characteristic of empathetic humans, where even though they can never be that other person, they've got skills, techniques to put themselves in their shoes and try and to feel it and to at least have empathy for it. Taking these two parts together, we have what we truly call empathy. Because if you just have one part, you're really, really great at the emotional mirroring component. You can make people feel certain ways. You make them feel like you feel them. You can actually change the course of a room or people's energy without taking their perspective, without seeing things from their side, without understanding where they're coming from, without truly living and treating them like a fully fledged human being. Those are actually markers of every true crime serial killer, TV show or real life story that you've ever watched, right? Characteristics of being very charismatic and convincing people, but not having any empathy, any perspective on the fact that they're really human. That's a scary, scary thing. So perspective taking is often the one that we want to develop because emotional mirroring is one that we can practice over time. Perspective taking is often the one that requires effort. So, okay, I want to give you some practical tips. So I want you to think about yourself as I talk through some of these practical tips. Now, here's the book that I mentioned. It's by Roman Kazarnik, and it's called Empathy. It talks about why it matters and how we get it. And he gives you 6 tips, 6 habits of highly empathetic people. People who are empathetic, that are good at the emotional mirroring and tend to perspective take, have a curiosity about strangers, people that they don't know. They want to strike up conversations with them. They want to learn about their lives. They want to, whether physically or in a distributed way or via something like reading, learn about them. Number 2, in learning about them, those people seek to create a habit of actually challenging their own prejudices. So for myself, as I mentioned earlier, there's no possible way that I can truly know what the lived experience is of being female, for example, or being someone from a different socioeconomic background. But I can every day be aware that I have prejudices and biases, be aware that I've got certain affinities, and then go hunting as I cultivate my curiosity about these strangers and actively make a practice, a habit of saying, oh, geez, I discovered something new and different about people that I didn't know before, and I challenge my own prejudices about it. I'm actively working against my biases, and I'm actively connecting between, say, genders, socioeconomic backgrounds, race, and any other elements of that. Number 3, literally or metaphorically, try another person's life. Fiction is really great for this, whether you're talking about reading or watching a documentary or watching, just a very realistic kind of drama, for example. You might never be able to live somebody else's experience, but certainly experiencing narratives and stories told by other people is an excellent opportunity to do that. Roman goes on to talk about a user experience designer before a user experience design was a thing, where they were talking about design of physical spaces, design of everyday objects, where there was a female designer in a world of men. This is a couple of decades ago, where she herself challenged by being a bit of an outsider compared to her cohort, by talking about, well, what about usability for the perspective of the people that are less able-bodied? What about disabled people? What about like ramps? What about like what they need for can openers, how they handle doors, etc. And she went to the extreme personal trying out somebody else's life by doing things like binding her hands so that she didn't have the full range of motion that was available to her, by weighing her body down so she'd be a little bit stooped when she was walking around, so that even though she couldn't do it, she made explicit steps to experience what everyday life was like for the less able-bodied, so that she could become a better and more effective designer. And the book's got some really great case studies along those lines, but it's definitely an example of what we mean when we say try another person's life. Okay, listen hard and open up. It's not just enough to cultivate curiosity and challenge your prejudices. There is a practice to listening, to really mirroring someone's emotions, to really accepting what they have to say, not at word value or face value, but trying to say, is this what you mean? Trying to understand it very deeply. If you've come to some of my other seminars before, you know that we talk about psychological safety. And one key component of psychological safety is what we call ostentatious listening. That's the same thing as this, right? Where you repeat what somebody else has said to make sure that you understood them in your own words. Maybe you try to get the best example and thing they're really trying to say to make sure that you heard them well and deeply. So Roman, of course, is a wonderful instigator of change. And he says that, well, once you get empathetic, part of using your empathy is to pay it back to society, inspire mass action, do social change, tell stories about your journey in empathy. You can blog it. You can have seminars like me. You can just tell a friend. You can work on it with your family. There's 101 little actions that you can do to create social change and spread your empathy forward. Last but not least is develop an ambitious imagination. How much more can people understand each other than they're currently doing? Right? Don't just follow these tips, but the 6th tip is almost like a meta tip. If it's not on this list of tips, what more can you do? I kind of leave that exercise to you. Speaking of exercises, let's make it a little bit practical, a little bit interactive. Byron's going to pull up a poll here. I want to ask you to consider the 6 things that you just learned about empathy. Consider them for yourself in your context. What's one habit out of these 6 that you want to cultivate? Click on one that you want to vote for. And as you're voting for that, I want you to think and commit to a very practical action that you can do to commit to that. Something that you start doing, something that you might do differently, something that maybe you're currently doing, but you're just going to make an effort to do it better. Something that maybe you need to do less. You're like, oh, wait a second. I realize that I don't listen very much. I'm going to stop interrupting people, for example, a little less. I'm going to start doing that. If you feel comfortable, I invite you to write it into the chat comments at the bottom of the Zoom there. So vote for something and then click on the chat comments there. Just type something if you like. Give everybody just a minute to do that. Okay, we can share the results of the poll. It looks like we've got a nice little range of different things that people would like to do. I'm very interested in some of the comments, if there were any brave souls. Oh, no brave souls to put us out on chat. I'm going to ask and invite you to share a few times throughout this session. Don't feel obligated to do so if you don't feel comfortable with it. Okay, let's talk about authority, power, influence, and power dynamics. The second key ingredient to powerful distributed teams. Power. What is it? Again, there's a lot of different definitions, but I'll give you this one for the purpose of our context. Power, for the purposes of our conversation with respect to teams, is positional power. It's of course relative to others. You might be a team lead in a much wider organization for which there might be, I don't know, portfolio and program managers that outrank you, executives that outrank them, and then general managers that outrank them, and then senior executives that outrank them, right? You still have power because you might have positional authority that you can exercise over others. So some examples of that are things like formal job title, recognized expertise, or maybe an ability to coerce via rewards or via quid pro quo. I'll do something for you, you can do something for me. So that's one definition of power. Let me compare and contrast that with the second definition. Influence. Influence here is the ability to guide a group towards an action. You'll notice that it's a much softer or differently oriented way to affect people. It's about an ability, it's about guidance, and it affects groups, particularly to action. Again, it's a way to change things, just like empathy is a way to change things. Some examples of that is people's persuasive power. Some examples of that, people's inspirational power. Some of that is people's openness or mindset or capability to talk and influence others to collaborate with them. So to summarize, we talked about two kinds of power. Number one, raw power, positional power. Number two, influence. You can also actually think of influence kind of like personality. So we've got positional and authority. So here, we've got the interplay of two power dynamics, two things that people can use, control, influence, change people that are forever at play. So you're like, oh, geez, Steve, that sounds like super Machiavellian to start thinking about this. You're talking about like analyzing people's empathy and what emotions they're feeling and then trying to take their perspective. You know, I kind of get that. It's hopefully if you truly take someone's perspective, then if you're doing it well and deeply and effectively, you never do it in order to harm somebody because you can see it from their shoes. But we are talking about now also being very aware of power dynamics, positional power, personality power. Why should I worry about these things? It sounds kind of Machiavellian. Well, these kind of interactions, worrying about these things matter because even if you pretend like they don't matter, they still exist, right? Just because we pretend like they're not there, humans are humans. Inevitably, two people start working together. There's definitely going to be power dynamics at play. If you're an agilist like myself, you'll know that the number one thing that the Agile Manifesto reminds us to do is to emphasize people and how they interact over inhuman kinds of processes and tools. If you want to think about it differently, not having positive power dynamics actually influences and in some cases might detract from a good company culture. It prevents people from doing good things on behalf of the company that otherwise might do. It shapes and definitely deforms communications. It means that people start not saying the things that they really mean. It starts lowering the average intelligence of team members all over the organization. And of course, last but certainly not least, it basically derails your capability as a team or as an organization to collaborate. So hopefully there made a bit of a case for change about why we care about worrying about power dynamics. So the next question you should definitely ask me is, Steve, cool, I hear you. What are we going to do differently? Well, let me give you some pro tips. Irrespective of where you are, because remember, even positional raw power is relative. You might be a team lead. You might even just be a not the most junior person on your team. Already, you have a way in which you can contribute to your team's power dynamic. Even if you're the most junior person in the team, there's a position, there's things that you can do to play. You can make explicit statements in working and collaborating with your team and say, hey, I'm going to try these things to see if I can't write, change, update, improve our power dynamic. Number two, some of the very explicit things that you can do or try is in interactions, whether we're talking about webinars or conversations, to actively encourage yourself to speak up if you happen to be more recalcitrant, to pass the conversational stick if you're extrovert like me, from maybe other people who talk a lot, to say, hey, Jill, you're a particularly quiet person, but we love you and your contributions to your team. Do you have anything to say about that? You can tamp down on the overshares by saying, oh, Joe, I really enjoy that contribution, but and thank you, we've noted it down. But let's hear from Kim, who doesn't normally speak in this particular context. So we're creating safer opportunities for her so that everybody has an opportunity to share. If you're an agile coach like myself, you care a lot about these conversational dynamics, and we have various sharing practices. One example being things like quiet writing time. Hey guys, I got a topic about this. I kind of want everyone to weigh in on it. I'm just going to give you a minute to think about it, to write it down and share with us what your thoughts are, so that we even up and even out any power dynamics of people talking or over talking, oversharing, talking over somebody else. It creates a lot of conversational quality there. So number three, of course, same as the empathetic one, you can always invest in some of your shared team's understanding of each other. You can use tools like StrengthsFinder, like the DISC profile, like the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Don't just do the test for the sake of doing the test. Once you do it, it's not some box for who you are. Those are very dysfunctional ways to use that kind of assessment. But once you've done it together as a team, you've kind of taken a diagnostic of what each individual team member is thinking, feeling, acting. And I encourage you to use it positively as a basis for understanding each other better, a capability, a very good data set you can draw on when you go back to the empathetic point to seek their perspective and work out, oh, this is why that person feels that way or says those things or acts in these ways, because of both the power dynamic and who they are and where they've come from, etc., in trying to establish a more empathetic self. So yeah, you can invest in a habit of teams investing in themselves and each other, of finding their strengths and having conversations about it to grow deeper together. You can then, based on those things, emphasize shared goals. Okay, we understand and cherish each and every individual person. We've got a lot of conversational quality, but let's do things together as a team. My third point will be focused a lot on what things that we do together as a team. So, I won't dwell too much on this example, but some really good starting points are things like team charters. Why is my team here in the first place? Why do they exist? How do they add value to our organization? What are our priorities as an organization? Do we emphasize caring about each other over getting stuff done? Or is getting stuff done a totally part of caring about each other? What are the sort of things that we value as a team? You can create various mechanisms, so charters, priority sliders, and some measures to help your team set and create and set shared goals that they're aligned to and accountable for. As part of that, of course, setting clear roles and responsibilities. Again, you can use the same mechanism, charters, etc., to establish this person is responsible for this aspect of the team. It certainly helps clarify any storming aspects as your team comes together, looks at its power dynamic and goes, oh, wait a second, given that we're now all distributed, we really need to make a reinvestment in examining who we are, how we interact with each other. And toward that end, let's also at least look at our roles and responsibilities, validate, vet them. Is that what we want to do? Is that what we want to invest in moving forward? Last but not least, very important here is define decision-making patterns. This is the way that we're going to decide things as a team from now on. I might advise you, if you haven't heard of this before, but something called the advice decision-making pattern, where it's not a king one where one powerful person gets to say this is exactly what we do, and it's not a consensus-based one where we talk about it. We need everybody to vote exactly the same way. It's not a voting one where it's just about the proportional majority share, but the advice process is all about asking a set number of people for their advice before you make a decision, and then going ahead and making the decision because you're well informed by a limited number of experts in the right position. For key and more important decisions that you might make, you need to ask a commiserately higher number of people, as well as a commiserately more senior group of people. But you still have the decisioning authority to make that. By picking one of these dynamics, you will have set yourself and your teams on a path, at least to enabling, as in number one, investing in, as in number three, or very, very actively nurturing different and healthy power dynamics in your team, as in actions 2 and 6. So I'm going to throw it over to you guys now. Thinking about your context, your teams, something that you're coaching perhaps. What area would you like to focus on? Have a look at the poll that Byron's pulled up there. Make a commitment to yourself. Hey, coming out of this seminar, I'm going to improve on this one particular aspect. If you want to be a brave soul, and I encourage you to be a brave soul as part of this webinar, make a commitment in the web chat, right? This is the thing that I'm going to do differently to address the power dynamic in a team that I'm a member of. I'll give you a minute to think about that, to vote and to write a comment in there. Okay. Anybody want to add a chat comment, a commitment that they're going to make to change something in the dynamic of their team? Okay. Byron, can you share those results? We've got some really interesting results here, guys. We've got 5 people on the webinar, and you'll notice that these are in a certain pattern. At the start, a lot of them are just enabling actions. You know, what can you do? Hey, start nurturing your conversations. In the middle, they're sort of deepening and fostering and growing actions to make it better. And the last one is sort of like exponentially good outcomes. So it's very interesting to see that a good 80% of the 5 people here, 4 of the 5 people here, are looking to invest in themselves personally to enable themselves to be a member of the decision making or to claim some power for themselves. And then they think perhaps there's some conversational dynamics to nurture there. I'm very interested if people want to make some comments about what they want to commit to themselves, to have some time for questions or clarity if you're looking for that later in the webinar. Okay, thank you, Byron, for doing that. Let's move forward. Let's come to the final topic. Here we're talking about the most powerful force in all agility and definitely in organizational capability, enabled by things like empathy and health power dynamics. We're talking about, when we talk about agility, investing in teams. Specifically, the way that in general we invest in teams of people are growing their empathy, writing their power dynamics, giving them what we call maturity in their ways of working that we would probably tailor for the context, at least in the current state, for distributed teams. If you're interested in that, Nemos has got an ebook. There's a resources page at the end. I'll share with you a link to it. We've got some very practical pro tips on how to do that, and that's the content of a different webinar. But essentially, by investing and focusing in teams, we can create better morale in teams. Oh, wait a second, my team members suddenly have greater empathy for me. They're listening to things I'm saying. I have more power in the team so that I can contribute to it actively. Hopefully that leads to better practices, which is an increase in maturity for the team. And then that leads to leaders saying, oh my gosh, this team looks like they become more high performing as a result of being internal facing for a moment, recognizing their power dynamics, investing in their empathy together. And of course, they're like, hey guys, you're doing a really great job. And then you get a morale boost again. There's this wonderful, wonderful cycle of team investment that is at the very heart of what we're talking about when we talk about agility. So to help increase this flywheel, we apply the practice of what we call agile coaching, observing teams, coaching them, giving them advice, giving them feedback, helping them remove what we call impediments, things that might be blockers to create a shared empathetic understanding, or blockers to an increased level of more effective and efficient decisioning, for example, inside the team. Our hope, and here's the secret sauce that I want to tell you, is that this then leads to two key things. Number one, the team's ability and psychological safety to be able to say, this is how much effort, this is how much capacity we have in a team to give in any given period of time, like a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. If you're an agilist, or at least you've heard the concept of velocity, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. This is how much a team can do in this period of time. We now feel safe enough to worry about how hard outcomes and make those things visible. The second part, arguably the much harder part, is articulating, and I told you I'd be telling you a lot about this later, what contribution from a practical perspective, a real monetary outcome perspective, our team actually makes to our parent organization. That's an articulation of value. Taking one and dividing by the other, value divided by effort, we get the holy grail of general management. Coming back to the original case, this is what we're looking for. This is how you get organizations to outperform despite organizations facing societal headwinds. And I strongly urge you to think about empathy and investing in it at a team level. I strongly urge you to think about power dynamics and writing it. I strongly urge you to work on your teams, measuring what their capacity is and articulating what value they provide to the organization, charting and dividing one by the other so it's visible, and of course, therefore you can manage it. You definitely, if you're a Deming or lean person, you definitely know the saying, you can't improve what you can't measure. You can't measure what you can't even see. So measure it, make it visible, and then do something about it. Okay, so let me give you some specific examples, which is not to say that you need to use exactly this example. A measure of a team's maturity could be a measure that we use at Nomos. In this particular case, this is a cut down version of a maturity measure. It's a team health measure. Do they have healthy empathy? Do they have good psychological safety? Do they have good power dynamics? Do they have good practices like planning? Do they have a team charter? Those sort of things. And you'll notice that there's two flavors of them. One for what we call classic Scrum teams that delivers things in that kind of project incremental and iterative mode where there might be a cost center to their business, and it might be a profit center to their business, and B, supporting elements that might run in, again, if you're an agilist, what we call a Kanban style, a BAU style, an operational style, where they're looking to support their teams. They're often a cost basis on behalf of the teams. So we've got some measures. I'll send you this pack afterwards, of course, so you can look at them in some detail. And if you're interested, we actually have a survey that you can do on your teams, live on our website, that you can just go there, fill in. It's only 6 questions, takes about 10 minutes, and it gives you a bit of a score as to how well your team is currently doing on this front. So if you get it measured by that, you make something visible, it becomes a good conversation for your team to have. How can we get better practices-wise as a team? B, you then start measuring a team for size. So this is from a real organization that we work with over the course of 28 sprints, which is a 2-week period. They were across 20 teams. So we're talking about like 180, 200 people here. And it's time adjusted for the team formation because different people join the teams at different times. Just by creating visibility in this ways of working and ensuring that we're tracking their maturity, we started measuring, of course, how much capacity the team had. And by improving their practices, caring about each other, being empathetic, etc., with it, we increased it by a huge exponential outcome. It went at a 9-week moving average from just 10, and you can imagine it to be an abstract 10. It could be like $10,000 of spend or 10 widgets made, to 45 widgets over the same period of time. So we didn't add more team members, we didn't change them, we just helped improve their practices at this real financial institution for 200 people in 20 teams over the course of 9 sprints. We increased how much the team was able to do without making anyone work like harder or crazy hours or adding people to the team by 350%, just by increasing the capacity. Of course, you'll never know whether you actually did that or not if you don't measure it. The second one, the third one, the first one is maturity. The second one is a size and a capacity. The third one is value. What value is the team delivering on behalf of the organization? I can't answer in this forum this question for you, but I can provide you with a tool and technique that you might go about doing it. This is inspired by something called Mountain Goat Software's value-based prioritization framework. For those of you who are agilists, you'll also know this as the shorted weighted job first framework and or a similar version of that. This is Nomos's bespoke one. What we do here is we ask teams and organizations to say, articulate one, maybe up to seven, but usually we're aiming for three things that your team adds to the organization, right? Things that they're doing on behalf of it. Oh, I help the organization tackle urgent things. I help improve their reputation. I make the organization sexier. I improve their X factor in some way. I might care about I might be building a product, so there's some product criteria for what success looks like. You articulate those things and you weight them. Then any scope item that the team is delivering or working on or articulating, you can then measure against it. So you can see in this particular example, scope item 1 helps with urgency a little bit, helps a lot with reputation, doesn't really help with the X factor, doesn't help with this product criteria. So the weighted value using this particular tool and technique is 86, and therefore the size that is estimated by the team for this to deliver is 13. Therefore, we can work out the ROI. I can get 86 widgets worth of value to my organization if I spend 13 widgets worth of value. That ROI ratio is a quick, easy, dirty measure that teams can do on a practical scope item by scope item basis to then demonstrate their value add to the organization. So simply by taking 3 simple metrics, the first one is team's maturity, the second one is team's capacity, the third one is team's value, you can create some really powerful ROI outcomes. So this comes from a different organization again, over the course of 10 months of coaching. Now we're talking about value, the value to organization divided by the capacity of the team. In this particular scenario, it went from 0.3 to 0.7, which is an increase of about 150% over the course of this 11 months for this particular set of teams. You can demonstrate that, you can measure it, you can keep a good thing going, and hopefully at the center of everything that you're doing is investing in people by worrying about their empathy and investing in healthy team interactions by worrying about things like the power dynamic. Here's just one more example in case you needed it. On some projects that have never worked agile before, transitioning them suddenly can be a godsend. Now, I've classified for this particular organization as a governmental organization, but we rescued an agile project with them. And the increase in productivity using the same measures that I talked to you is 4,800% on the rescue project. And for the ones that didn't start in this particular Scrum way, which is a framework for thinking about the things that I just articulated in terms of team practices, they improved their team just by applying these practices by between 300 to 660% in terms of measurable, metricizable outcome. When you start doing things like this, gosh, you can come back to your organization and say, hey, this is definitely a case for change. We want to keep investing in this. You would have a crazy CEO or COO not to support you on your endeavors to continue that good thing going in your organization. Okay, so practical actions. What can you do? We'll throw it over to you guys again. If you haven't already done this, one of the very first things you could do is measure your team's maturity. You can use our tool, but there's a lot of maturity measurement tools out there if you're interested. Number 2, you can measure your team's capacity in the same way that I demonstrated what the velocity looked like, whether you're a Scrum team or not. How much effort can a team deliver over this period of time? Third one, measure and articulate the value that the team provides to the organization. And number 4, provide that insight to the key decision makers that help make that case for change and drive an organizational societal change. I'm going to throw it over to you guys because we definitely want to be action-oriented in this webinar. And this is the last and final poll I'll give you. I want you to think about, for you and your context and your team, what are you going to worry about? What are you going to take an action on? We'll make a little vote there and then commit to yourself by typing out an action to everyone else on the webinar. This is what I'm going to do on behalf of my teams to improve the way that we demonstrate outcomes. If you're already finished, I encourage you to put fingers to keyboard and give me your thoughts on an action that you'll tangibly take to do something to move this forward. Just in the chat window there. Okay, so it looks like we're thinking about measuring our team's maturity and providing insight to the return on investment. That's great. Hopefully that implies that our team members already have some kind of measure of maturity and capacity. I'm sure being a CEO myself, I would really, really welcome that conversation. And I'm sure when you bring it back to your parent organizations, that's the kind of thing that will get a lot of goodwill to help the changes that we make keep going. Okay, so what have we talked about this session? 3 key things. The first one on the bottom left there, we talked about empathy, which is about emotional mirroring and about perspective taking. There were 2 elements. And we talked about 6 highly effective habits of highly empathetic people. And you made a commitment to yourself to worry about one of those 6. And hopefully you took away an action that you're gonna do to make something happen in that space for you and your teams. Number 2, we talked about power dynamics. We talked about the difference between power and influence and how many people can do things. We talked about its dire importance to distributed teams. And we gave some practical tips to enable yourself to use your influence to help your team for the better. I encourage you to use those 2 superpowers, knowing and understanding people, and then knowing and understanding how people interact with each other towards a wonderful end for you and your organization, where you start measuring the output versus outcome, and you can take a practical action to measure your team's velocity, their maturity, their capacity, and provide some insight in the return to investment. Using just these 3 simple tips, you can meet what I promised you at the start of helping enable organizations in situations as dire as the one that society in our world is in right now, during this period, investing in your people, your practices, your psychological safety, etc., to come out of the gate should the environment turn, when the environment turns not adverse to us, it should become favorable to us again, you can come right out of the gate, be part of the 9% of those organizations that exceed their competitors because they took the right kinds of preparation during this particular cycle. Okay, that's everything that I wanted to talk about today. I will share with you this pack afterwards. There's a link to the blog, link to the book about empathy. There's a link to the health check and some of the supporting resources, including the prioritization tools. This is part of a wider series of webinars that we've got. So we'll talk about great distributed teams today. In 3 weeks' time, we're going to talk about better than face-to-face, the future of distributed teams, the future of work, the 5 stages of distributed work, leveraging and how to make it work for you, leveraging asynchronism, how you can leverage the power of teams actually not being together and worrying about things like work-life balance. We'll talk about learning and leading later, agile mindsets later, etc. So there's a lot of good content. Hopefully you sign up for this series. You can find us on Eventbrite. You can hit us up. It's been a wonderful crew. At this point in time, while I would love for you to give us some feedback about how to improve this webinar, how we can make it more practical for you, how we can make it more actionable, you can scan this, you can go to the feedback page, just give us it's a 30-second survey. While I've got everybody here in the last 3 minutes, if anyone's got any questions, feel free to turn your microphone on and ask me a question or put it into the chat. I'm very interested to hear from you if you've got something burning that you wanted to discuss or something you wanted to ask me. Okay, it doesn't look like there's any questions. Just final call if anyone wants to discuss something or ask for a tip or any additional help. Okay, you've been an absolutely wonderful audience. Thank you all very much. I hope I added some value to your investment of 50 minutes with me on this webinar. It's been a privilege to present to you. Please take a moment to give us some feedback to help us improve for me as a presenter, for us as an organization, any part of this particular experience. I hope to see you in 3 weeks' time, and I hope to hear from you about how you're going about putting your empathy into practice and building habits for that. addressing the power dynamics in your team, and or creating some visibility around maturity, velocity, and value to your organization, and presenting that back to keep a good thing going. Thank you all very much for your time. Have a wonderful, safe, and healthy rest of your day. Take it easy. See you later.